Okay, this was inspired by a tweet yesterday that we got from Michael Harrison. Shout out, Michael Harrison. Thank you for this. He said yesterday, and I read this yesterday, he said, Gill, I've learned so much from your show the last few years, and I'm grateful for it. It has, however, ruined my ability to watch and talk NFL with casual fans, trying to explain why Todd Bowles went for 2 to cut it to 6, down from 8. It's hard, he says, trying to explain that to stubborn 50-year-old dudes was as frustrating as you might imagine. So we talked about it. We read that tweet yesterday. I didn't think much about it. I was like, oh, yeah, I can, we all have people who it's still tough to explain to it. And it occurred to me, it's not just, I don't want to disparage because it's not intuitive for most.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not. And so randomly last night, and the reason that this was jogged in my head, again, me, Fezzik, Falika, Will Hill, and Todd Wishnev are on a text thread together. It's typically for Todd in college basketball, but, we'll get on these sidebars. And yesterday, me and Fezzik, much to the dismay of Falika, Will, and Todd, got into this thing about what's the best way to convey to people why it is optimal to go for 2 when down 14 late in a football game. And my thing with this is Fezzik is so smart that one of the things that I have to say to him is I go, yes, but you have to understand that conveying that information is a different matter than what you believe to be so intuitive. And so the challenge here is we decided we're going to do this exercise. Because do you believe you know the reason why? Can you explain it to somebody?
Yeah, I do, but I always think I understand the confusion.
Yeah.
I also think that even with, I think what Eric said about the Monty Hall, going back to that, like there's always little things that if you say a certain way, it triggers something in someone's brain to understand it better.
Correct.
So the one that I always try to preface this one with is the goal with all of this is to win the game in regulation. And I don't think that enough people understand that.
Okay, well, let's not. Okay, let me do it my way. And maybe.
Okay.
I don't want to muddy it. All right, so now we don't. This is radio. We don't have a chalkboard. We don't have paper and pencil. So I'm going to try to explain this as easily as I can. So we have to make some. Let's just start with some basic. Let's make the math as easy as possible.
Okay.
Okay. If you're down 14 and you decide to kick the extra points twice, by the way, the assumption in all of this is that after you score the first time, you stop the other team and you score a second time. Otherwise, there's no point in even having this conversation.
There's also that. Yeah.
Okay. But let's just start there. Let's just say, for making the math simple, you make extra points 100% of the time. We know that's not true, but for the math of this, you make the extra points 100% of the time, and you make the 2-point conversions 50% of the time. Okay?
Yep.
And if a game goes to overtime, you win 50% of the time. Okay? None of those are exactly accurate, but for the math of this is how you explain it. Extra points you make every time, 2-point conversions you make half the time. When a game goes to overtime, you win it half the time. And again, the assumption that if you score the first time, you stop the other team and you score a second time. Okay, so if you kick the extra points, right, you're going to force overtime, right? You cut it to 7. You stop the other team. You score again. You kick the second extra point. You force overtime. We've already established you win 50% of the time, right? 1/2 of the time. So think about a fraction, 1/2. Okay, 50% of the time. If you go for 2, okay, and you make it, which happens 50% of the time, you're going to win the football game, okay? So that would, if you go for 2, you win 50% of the time, okay? 1/2, half the time. Except for when you go for 2, there's an extra thing that happens. Even if you miss that 2, right, you get a second shot at the 2 that you will hit 50% of the time, which will force overtime, which you will win 50% of the time. So that extra caveat in math, right? You miss the 2, you make the 2, you force overtime, you win half the time, is by fraction, half times half times half, which is an eighth. So if you took 4/8, 1/2, right? When you kick the extra points is actually 4/8 versus 4/8 plus 1/8.
Yes.
That is why you go for 2, ladies and gentlemen. That is your explanation. That's algebra. For someone like Steve, that's super simple junior high school math.
Yeah.
But when if you explain that to your average football fan in that way, hopefully that rings home. Now, there's going to be a full segment of the audience that just heard that that's like, I have no idea. I have no idea. But you got that.
Yeah, it's the 5/8 versus 4/8 thing. Yeah,
it's 5/8 versus 4/8.
Yeah.
It's very simple math. And that is the easiest way to convey that subject. So, anyway, there it is.
Yeah, and I think it becomes, I mean, even if you had some coaches, like we've questioned throughout this entire season, right? How many coaches we've asked different guests this, right? We've talked to different people. How many coaches do you think are comfortable with this and know to do this?
Right, because, I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, I think that, we were talking about this past weekend, and the one point that I made is that it becomes even more important now that we're in the playoffs and we have these new overtime rules in the playoffs, right? That there's always going to be another opportunity for the other team to catch up. So you want to be able to, if you have the chance to end in regulation, you want to be able to do that as much as you possibly can.
And as I'm just anticipating listener reaction to that, yes, certain teams have mastered the tuchus push, right? The Eagles. Certain teams are smaller, and so maybe they don't feel as confident in two-point conversions. We're not talking about those variables. I'm just talking about the strict math of it. What you were getting at, I think, Kelley, can be distilled to this. What we're really fighting is decades of the confirmation bias of the way you play football and the way that our human brains are wired is to extend a game as long as possible, to stay alive, to not lose. And so and by the way, that's not invalid.
Right, it's not invalid. I'm kind of chugging it because it's kind of the way you describe Survivor. It's the flip of it. Like the goal is to win the game, not to survive as long as you can.
Exactly how I describe Survivor. The goal is to win, not to survive. That's right. By the way, did you see the Survivor documentary sizzle reel?
No.
Todd is in it for 5 seconds. He steals the show.
Oh, really? I got to check that out. I know. I haven't seen it.
It's so great. So he's trying to be basically the Shohei Ohtani, he was saying, of both of the contest millions and anyway, there is your math, and take that for what it's worth.
Well, and I think the part, just to add on to what you're saying of what we've heard all of our lives, how many times have you heard on a broadcast from your father, from your friends, that it was, you don't go for 2 until you have to go for 2?
Remember, there's a chart, remember?
Yeah.
There used to be the chart when you go for it or not.
Right? And this is where I think that rule still applies in this situation. It's just tough for people to think about this situation as being, it's time for go to 2. You have to go for 2.
Our brains are wired for survival, and this math disproves that, right? What we're trying to do is say to the person who feels it's too risky that in fact it is not too risky, that it is the opposite, right? So, that's the whole story there.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.